Greetings, dear listeners. So, was Hungary ever really the dictatorship Western liberals wanted us to believe it was? If a supposed autocrat loses a vote and walks away, what does that tell us about the category we put him in? This week, Shadi and I had Julian Waller on, a professorial lecturer in political science at George Washington University and co-author of the book Autocrats Can't Always Get What They Want: State Institutions and Autonomy Under Authoritarianism. I'll get out of the way, there's a lot to talk about. Before we get started, a reminder to head on over to wisdomofcrowds.live and consider becoming a paying subscriber if you're not one yet. And don't forget to give us a like and review on your favorite podcast app. With all that out of the way, on to the show. All right, Julian, thanks for joining us. It's a real pleasure to have you here. I felt like as soon as the elections in Hungary happened and Orbán found himself out on the street this past week, I just immediately thought of your book, which is called Autocrats Can't Always Get What They Want. And I thought, what better person to have on the podcast to talk about what just happened in Hungary. Shadi and I have sort of talked about this before in various ways. Shadi, you're a democracy person, like an actual credentialed democracy person. I'm just a filthy dilettante. I've got two credentialed democracy people here to talk about these things. I guess sort of the way to kick us off on this that I thought is there's that famous saying, what is like a Buddhist saying, if a tree falls in the forest and no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound? Like, maybe this is a stretch, but like if an authoritarian leader or an authoritarian regime loses power in a vote, was it properly authoritarian to begin with? I don't know. So I don't know, maybe let's start that question, Julian. We've always talked about authoritarian tendencies in Hungary, and like I said, Shadi and I have kicked that around. What does it mean to be authoritarian? And I know there's all sorts of classifications for this, which we can get into the technical stuff. But I'm just beyond the sort of technical jargon that the field discusses. What do we make of our assessments of Hungary up until now? If Orbán lost and left quietly.
It's a fabulous question, and thanks for having me on. Really good to see you both. I'm excited to dive into this. So your question is something like 17 different questions, some of which have entire research agendas focused on it, multiple books of the subject. And I think we should absolutely start with the question of, all right, did we get it? Do we have this right? Right? Are we using the right words or labels or terminology or conceptual distinctions to describe Hungary? And that sounds kind of annoying. That sounds very much so like a political scientist trying to create little different category boxes that we can then drop countries into and try to understand patterns thereof. But that's exactly what we do. The problem is sometimes our little category distinctions turn into journalistic shorthands. And we suddenly we start with nice, narrow distinctions of electoral authoritarianism, electoral autocracy, or competitive authoritarianism. And then we get political articles or Washington Post articles that say, well, the dictator has just fallen in Budapest, right? And what does that exactly mean?
Well, isn't that part of the problem, though, that we are calling him a dictator, that we are thinking about him as an autocrat? I almost think that your book is called Autocrats Don't Always Get What They Want. Should we even include Orbán in that category that your book discusses?
It's a fabulous question. So I'll give you, unfortunately, I could give you the breezy answer, but let's get into some of the technical details in terms of how we want to describe what we're talking about, right? So from my perspective, from our book's perspective, which is a co-authored book, written not only by me, but also Nathan Brown, Stephen Schaff, and Simran Abtawi, and we're focusing on sort of internal organizational, institutional characteristics inside authoritarian regimes. I can get into that later. But just as a basic level set for how we should think about this, Authoritarianism, in the political sense and the regime type sense, refers to any political system, any political regime that is not a democracy. It's a residual category. It's kind of an annoying residual category. Many people push back against this. Are you sure X is really authoritarian? Are you sure Y is really authoritarian? Or by creating this kind of big umbrella, what does it really mean? And that's fine, but we have to start somewhere. And where we start, because we live in an age of democracy, is we start with democracy, and we live in Western countries as well. Democracy refers to a system of government in which the apex decision-making political offices are chosen in regular multi-party elections, a competitive struggle for the people's vote, to use the old Schumpeter definition, in which electoral outcomes are uncertain, right? And that's the sort of free and fair aspect. So the three key elements of democracy at the very, very baseline is, one, the idea that first, the most important decision-making officials are elected, right? We don't have juntas, we don't have kings, we don't have tutelary figures that actually determine things, or dictators who are not connected to electoral processes. That's thing one. Thing two is broad suffrage, right? So you can have very competitive elections that are ultimately oligarchic with small groups of people voting. You can see this even in the medieval period, right? So we don't want just to say that elections mean democracy, obviously, but under broad suffrage with multiple parties. And then the free and fair component gets into the meat of where we have these, does X count or does Y count? And it's all about the ability for essentially parties to lose power. Insofar as that uncertainty is there, then we can consider the electoral playing field reasonably free and fair. That doesn't mean it has to be equal.
But there's a slider there, right? Like that's the thing, and that's where like journalists and shorthand and like Twitter polemicists and democracy activists and stuff sort of fall into, well, like I don't know if it's a rhetorical trap. It's just like the game that's played, right? Like it's the one thing that's I think apparent, and something that Orbán spent 16 years in government, 16 years, not all 16 years he was doing this, last I don't know, handful, really trying to make it less free and fair. And so arguably in that sense, on whatever sliding thing, it's not like authoritarian or democracy, it's something, right?
Right. Well, we start with the first, there's like three levels here. First one is the simple binary, and people, you can always fight against the binary, but the binary level sets, right? So first is the binary democracy, not democracy. We're called not democracy authoritarianism. Okay. That tells us very little, right? Doesn't tell us very much at all. But we start there. Then we can divide things in two major distinct ways. This is how scholarship tends to do so. The first is a sliding scale. This is what I call the spectrum approach. You'll see this a lot in the big democracy indices and data sets, where you get like a number, you get like 0.75 on the democracy scale, you get 0.8 democracy widgets, and that means you're good. But if you get 0.2, that means you're bad, right? So VDEM does this. Freedom House is the first think tank to have done this sort of thing. They're really nice for quantitative purposes because it provides a point estimate of how democratic or how authoritarian you are. That's the idea, where there's a sliding scale, and you could argue there's either a cut point where like on one side it's democracy, on the other side it's authoritarianism, or you can say there's like a mushy middle. Hungary tends to occupy like the key place in that particular example. And then there's a different way to do it. And that different way is the older way, actually, to not have a sliding scale, but divide by type and subtype. So the military junta is fundamentally different from the theocracy. It is fundamentally different from the Communist Party state. It is fundamentally different from an absolute monarchy, right? And then is fundamentally different from the most common, the modal current authoritarian subtype, which is what's either called electoral authoritarianism or competitive authoritarianism. And what you do is, if you say, all right, we look around the world, Saudi Arabia is an absolute monarchy, right? China is a Communist Party state. Iran is a theocracy, so on and so forth. You divide, you have military juntas in Africa right now. And then we have a lot of places that have the exact same liberal, democratic, constitutional schema that you find around the world, right? Elected presidents, elected parliaments, independent, not only independent judiciaries, you have separation of powers to some degree, and all written down in a constitution with enumerated rights. Those don't necessarily exist in an absolute monarchy or a party state or a military junta, right, per se. They always exist in these electoral authoritarian regimes, and what the distinction is that the electoral playing field, the plausibility of uncertain outcome at a given electoral event is so systematically skewed that it's either impossible or it's very, very difficult. So we can cut things up that way if we'd like. These are all abstract concepts. These are tools, conceptual tools. If they're useful for us, we should use them. If they're not useful for us, they can be very misleading, right? And that gets us into the final aspect of this, which is the terminology of autocracy, dictatorship, authoritarianism, and so on. The problem is, at the end of the day, right now in 2026, the political science literature uses these interchangeably. And it does so, and if you read the article, sometimes people will say it, or there'll be a footnote that says we use autocracy and authoritarianism and dictatorship interchangeably, right? They'll go out, or it'll just become very implicit. That's a problem, and our book does the same thing. What we end up landing on is actually we want to use authoritarianism because it has fewer connotations. So autocracy has strong connotations of rule by one, right? Coming from the Greek where we're getting that. Dictatorship also has a strong connotation of the rule by one, and it also has the Roman connotations of temporariness or emergency, right? The dictator comes in to cut the Gordian knot or to solve the particular problem, and that's why we describe them as such, in sort of manual control. Authoritarianism is more neutral because it tells us, or it reminds us, that non-democracy takes many forms. There are forms of non-democracy which involve collective rule, or involve sort of small oligarchic rule, or involve a single leader figure who, however, does not have full control over the political system and has to negotiate regularly, either with just sort of other powers in the system, or with a institutionalized political party, or with a strong bureaucracy, or with certain traditions and norms that can't be broken. So there's a variety of reasons why we like this kind of neutral terminology, because again, it means that you don't say things like the autocrat or the dictator with the implication of the degree of authority, power, and control on the system that those sometimes imply. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does. Let's start applying this to Hungary now. Mm-hmm. So based on your schema, what was Viktor Orbán?
Hungary from 2010 to 2026 fits in that category of electoral authoritarianism, right? So it has a liberal democratic constitutional schema. It's parliamentary with a ceremonial president. This is inherited from the immediate post-communist period, even with the constitutional changes and the rewrite in 2011. The broad contours more or less remain the same, right? In terms of the big structure, but you still have a parliament, you still have the prime minister ultimately deciding the shot. So that fits first in that electoral authoritarian category. We don't want to use military junta. We don't want to use anything like that. And then in terms of that spectrum, that degree of skewness, essentially, Hungary is ultimately a very soft electoral authoritarian regime, right? Where the manipulation, the systematic manipulation of the electoral playing field is relatively mild compared to other peers. And this is where we find utility in these concepts, because we can compare and say, what does Hungary actually look like relative to other countries, right? So it's not useful for me to either use research coming from or descriptions and characteristics of the Chinese party state and apply it to Hungary. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense to talk about the personalist dictatorship in Uganda and expect that it's also going to apply to Hungary either. So if you want to look at the peer regimes, and we'll get into why Hungary counts in a second, because that's ultimately what we want to talk about. But when you look at peer regimes, Hungary fits in the general category of places like Serbia or Turkey or Russia, or
Russia, really?
Venezuela back in the day. Not now. So that's the distinction.
But you say Russia. It's like
Russia in the 2000s.
Russia today under Putin. Oh, not today.
No,
today it's
Russia.
Yeah.
Russia in the first two terms of Vladimir Putin.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and I would actually argue that Russia has moved to a different regime type, a personalist dictatorship, under a state of emergency due to the wartime situation, and actually that's causing lots of problems in Russia.
What about Mexico? Where would Mexico be considered a peer? I was surprised when you said that in your Twitter thread, because I would have never thought of Mexico as being in the same category as Hungary.
So I don't know. Talk to some Mexicans. Depends which Mexican you talk to.
So. Well, so in that Twitter thread, I think I said depending on your political persuasion. So I am not convinced that Mexico has moved over to the electoral authoritarianism category yet. In part because the ruling party is super popular. So even though whatever they do to the Constitutional Court or the broader judiciary, I'm not sure that's quite enough, but that's a conversation we can have. However, if Mexico were to fall on that side of the line, this binary or the blurry field, whatever you'd like, that would be a peer because the structures are the same, right? We're dealing with the same institutional format. The question is the degree to which the opposition can reasonably contest. That doesn't require the opposition to always win. There are democracies in which there is a natural ruling party that's ruled for most of the period of democracy. So key examples are Japan, or Christian democracy in Italy in the Cold War.
Japan
or
is fascinating to me. Like
social
just like the
democracy
single party democracy.
I know,
though. Like
I know,
mean, it's just wild.
And this is where like all of these categories breaking down. So we want to be specific about it, which is why we have this conversation, which is why political scientists are so anal and annoying about it, and why we fight over the labels. But those are the kind of peer regimes, and where you have the standard constitutional setup. You don't have tutelary bodies that intervene in politics. Everyone is formally elected, and then the question, and it's all multi-party elections. And what I would say additionally is it's not so hegemonic that the ruling party or the government party wins 90% of the vote. So Kazakhstan is a good counter case, where Kazakhstan, the ruling party gets something like 95% of the vote. There was even one election, they won 100%, and the president apologized and rewrote the constitution to make sure that there was mandatory minimal seats for the opposition because it looked weird. Technically, Kazakhstan is an electoral authoritarian regime using this schema, right? It formally has a presidentialist multi-party system, right? Standard model from the 1990s, but it's so dominant that it's essentially closed. De facto, you could call it closed. So we add an extra word to describe it. That's not Hungary, right? That's a little different.
To drill down on the Hungarian case, right? Like, I mean, the stuff that are like broadly discussed often, like wild gerrymandering, baked into the Constitution, I think, right? Like constitutional rewrite that actually baked in some of these sorts of things, and partly that's like an important thing because gerrymandering happens in democracies all the time. I want to sort of like drill into that because that's an interesting thing. And then media freedom, like basically like media capture, state media capture, a lot of cronyism and corruption. Orbán basically, used the power of the state, which is a huge media advertisement buyer, to force, basically corral the media. Is the sort of standard story about Hungary that's usually told. So that's correct, right?
That's absolutely correct. So right. So let's get into the actual like why does this count? Because we also
before that though, should we just maybe say a few words about how remarkable Peter Magyar's victory was, just for people who haven't been following closely? I think we need to establish that as the baseline of what's going on here, right?
You're right. Let's do that. But that also opens up another can of worms after that, because it's early days and we'll see what happens. But I also want to talk about like what should we be watching here to see whether this is a resurgence of democracy or some sort of weird competitive, turnover in an entrenched authoritarian system. Anyway, but that's the later question also. But yeah, I think that's right. Let's talk
about the victory.
Yeah.
So we'll talk about the victory, and then we'll go back to talking about sort of why we even put Hungary in this electoral authoritarian category and like what makes it systematically skewed. And then we'll flip on back over. That sounds great. And I will say, Dimir, not to bury the lead on this one, but from the research, the statistical evidence suggests that most authoritarian regimes, when they have a power transition or a regime change, just transition to another authoritarian regime.
Yeah, right. I mean, I know that,
and it might be another soft one, but
yeah.
So, but anyway, we'll talk about that later. So, in terms of the victory is tremendously profound, because it does exist in this lopsided playing field. We'll get to why that is in a second, but it's a huge victory. This is a stonking victory that, due to actually the somewhat gerrymandered nature of the Hungarian electoral system, produced a 2/3 constitutional majority in parliament for the TISA party, for Peter Magyar's party, under conditions where they win something like 55% of the vote, right? And this was always how Orbán was able to establish constitutional majorities, where he wasn't the most popular party, right, and gets close to 50% each time, but mechanically gets translated into 2/3 majorities. Magyar now has the same benefit because the victory was so significant, and because it was so widespread. on the single member district side of the electoral system, because Hungary, the parliament is elected of 199 members, roughly half, a little bit over half, are elected in single member district constituencies that we have in the US or the UK or in Canada, places like that. And then just a little bit under half is elected in a proportional system with a 5% threshold. And so what's interesting is that once you hit the tipping point past the gerrymandering level,
It's a landslide.
and it's a landslide, right? Exactly.
Which
You
is
have a
always the
cascade
thing in
effect.
gerrymandering. It's always the sort of
Yes.
the danger in gerrymandering, right?
So actually, I need to make a distinction. That's always the case in all single member district systems, right? So remember, Keir Starmer won a stonking majority in Great Britain under something like 35%, right? And that's a function of the three plus party system that dilutes votes in certain ways, so that if you're efficient and your voters are spread across nicely in the political geography, you can get big majorities even on small numbers. So that's for what it's worth. In all democratic political systems with this kind of electoral system, that is possible, where small changes can produce lopsided results. It's intentional. It's to create strong government that doesn't have to rely on coalition partners, right? So like that's not impermissible. The gerrymandering skews it. So not only do you get cascades, but the threshold to hit that cascade is higher, if that makes sense.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. So that's it's a major victory. It's a surprise. Overall, we didn't think that it was going to work this way. Some people, of course, came away thinking that Orbán was going to cancel elections, or
there was a lot of that.
Sort of...
You mentioned Serbia. There was a story that it looked like they were going to conjure up some sort of Ukrainian operation, and his buddy Vucic was going to do that. I mean, I follow Balkan stuff, so that's like it was sort of a hothouse thing. Yeah, but I mean, just you also, I think we'll put a link to the thread. I thought it was terrific, like on the eve of the election. I mean, it genuinely was not clear how it was going to go, and you were speculating that like actually Orbán could quite easily pull it out, and anyway.
Yeah, so I mean, so I wrote that for listeners. I wrote a Twitter thread, like 45 tweet Twitter thread, in lieu of writing a Substack because I didn't have time because I was teaching and we're pushing out a bunch of reports at work and all of that. But one of the things that's pretty clear is like given the lopsidedness of the system, it was certainly possible for Fidesz to come out and win, but it would be a narrow win given all the polling. But if TISA pulled it out, if they would win pretty big because there's an asymmetric nature to the competition. But I mean, one thing that's really tremendous about this constitutional majority is TISA can do whatever it wants. Or Peter Magyar can do whatever it wants as long as he is able to corral the people that were thrown into his party relatively last minute, of which we know very little, and we have no sense of what the factions within are. As long as he can keep that coherent, he can do anything, and he can run the polity however you'd like.
So one thing that I can't quite get my head around is considering how little access Peter Magyar and his party had to the national media, that my understanding is that he couldn't appear on national television. I know there was some debate about how accurate that was, but most of the media was closed to the opposition.
Yes.
And Fidesz,
just an aside, and we'll put this in the show notes too, but I don't know if you've seen it, Shadi. Julian, I'm sure you have. Is like he, right after his election, he shows up on the public TV channel, and it's the first time he's appeared, and he's like, "Shame on you, you evil bastards! You kept me off this channel." And then he's like, "You need to all resign." Like I'm shutting down this show. You evil bastards, basically. And it's an incredible clip, and it's we'll definitely put it in show notes. You should watch it if you haven't. But sorry, Shadi, that's I just wanted to put that aside.
But yeah, I mean, I saw that too. A very amazing moment. But also the fact that Fidesz, the party of Viktor Orbán, was able to use government resources to support its campaign. So the fact that you have all these factors, and you can maybe mention a few more of them. We covered, I guess, some of the main ones: gerrymandering, lack of access to national media, and government resources being used for the campaign. You would think that those three factors would make it very, very difficult, if not impossible, for the opposition to win, because ultimately for an opposition to win, people have to know about them. And it wasn't entirely clear how ordinary citizens would have access to Peter Magyar or know what TISA stood for and that sort of thing. But I think what the point you made in your thread is that the new media landscape is what allowed them to kind of bypass that you don't need to be on national TV to get a hearing. You just need to be online, and that can actually fill the gap. So maybe say more about how they were able to overcome some of those obstacles.
No, I mean, that's exactly right. So sometimes people get a little bit too stuck in the procedural aspects of how we think about democracy. Well, democracy, it's about this uncertain outcome, right? That this chance for your ruler to lose the election, right? And you get new guys. The throw the bums out component is really, really important. It's actually, why do democratic regimes work well? It's because they have this guaranteed succession mechanism and this really brutal way of punishing leaders when they do sufficiently poorly, whether right or wrong. It's not sophisticated. One reason why people hate populism, but populism is fundamentally a very democratic, fundamental to democracy itself. But so how do you skew uncertainty over outcome, right, over electoral outcome? And one key aspect is by eliminating alternative information flows, right? And you're going to be taught that in journalism 101. What you want is pluralism in the media space. And what Orbán did very quickly, actually, after coming to power, was really reshape the Hungarian media ecosystem such that it was difficult to find opposition content, such that sort of opposition or anti-government reporting was either suppressed or harder to find in general. And then you extrapolate that out to a voter base, where people are simply not able to have the full information. Opposition is not able to campaign in such a way that voters can have access to this easily, right? That's why it matters that the media ecosystem was so lopsided. And it was so lopsided due to peculiarities in the Hungarian media ecosystem. Newspapers are unprofitable. I think we know that in the United States. But newspapers are
peculiar.
really... I've never heard that before.
I thought that was just like an iron law of modernity that newspapers lose money, but yeah.
Yeah, but newspapers lose money. And so a major model of newspapers working is the wealthy economic figures, economic oligarchs, buying newspapers in order to both support it and also to provide an editorial line, right? This is extremely common everywhere around the world. It's weird that people forget this. What you want multiple different oligarchs buying different papers. So you have different editorial lines expressed and supported. That is useful to democracy for pluralistic purposes, right? For alternative information flow purposes. In Hungary, the wealthy tend not to do things like that. And the opposition at the time certainly didn't do things. Instead, the newspapers relied on a funding model whereby the government bought advertisement in newspapers and essentially supported them. So all you need to do is no longer buy advertising in opposition leading newspapers and only buy advertising in pro-government newspapers and say, hey, if you change your line, I'll start buying advertising in your newspaper. And then suddenly you're off to the races, right? That's one way to systematically skew. And then you do other things, right? You change the line of the public broadcaster. You develop a media cartel that also sort of provides input in terms of pro-government reporting and so on. But then that creates a systematic skew.
Is the conclusion though of the fact that there's an easy run around this? Not easy, obviously. I mean, again, you shouldn't undersell the achievement here and what was achieved, but that maybe does that change the threshold of what we need to think about when we talk about electoral authoritarianism? In the sense that the internet is kind of hard to squelch. I mean, you have to go to Iranian or Chinese or Russian levels to be able to do that. And to their discredit, they figured this out and have done so.
Yes,
but that changes the landscape maybe of what we can comfortably call. Well, I mean, yeah. Do we just have to say it's just a slightly nastier democracy? I think Mexico's an interesting example there too, because it's maybe they're all kind of a lot more threshold than we'd like to believe.
I mean, I think it's a pretty compelling argument that we have to take that gray zone seriously, or that Hungary is an edge case. Now, it's important to note the media ecosystem is only one. of the sort of components that we say
Right.
systematically skew.
Sure.
I think it happened to be the most important component for 2010 to 2020. I think like the Orbán regime really does rely on control of the media to both reinforce the government line and also to, again, ensure that the opposition is unable to sort of campaign in the way that it would. Many people point to the fact that it's sort of Fidesz media is dominant, especially in the rural countryside. All those places where those single member districts are going to end up voting for Fidesz. And as you were saying, Shadi, the difference now is that people's reading habits, people's information access options are not only different, but their reading habits are different. So whereas before in 2010 or 2015, you probably could say that the average Fidesz voter is reading Fidesz media in the newspapers, and that's the only thing he has access to, or he's looking at the national broadcaster. And the national broadcaster doesn't allow the opposition to come on, doesn't give them a fair hearing during elections, all of that. Well, we're in 2026. Everyone has a cell phone. Even the most rural, deep sections of Hungary, everyone has a cell phone. Everyone is imbibing things online. And what's developed in the Hungarian internet, because remember, Hungary has a very unique language, so it really matters what's written in Hungarian. But on the Hungarian internet, there are extremely popular news portals that aggregate stories in Hungarian, and there are both pro-government and anti-government versions of these. And they're very, very widely clicked on, which means that you have this sort of, you're able to bypass a lot of the thumb on the scale. There's no censorship of the internet at all. And there's a difference between access and ubiquity. There's one thing where you can find opposition content. A Russian can find opposition content if he really wants to in Russian. He has to go through a VPN, go find things on social media or what have you, or there's certain websites that you can still go to, but the media restrictions are much more closed, relatively speaking. By now, certainly since COVID, everyone gets their news online. Most people aren't watching the broadcaster in the way that they were.
So, I
Which
just
also
want to
changed things.
I want to just drill down on one important thing here, though, right? And this is, again, there's two ways to drill down on it. Again, this is a democratic victory. The people threw the bums out. Absolutely. Yep. Worth remembering, up until 2 years ago, after a scandal, Magyar himself was a Fidesz guy. Yes. He is of the same party. Again, democracy and opportunism, there's nothing wrong with that. Not at all. He's a very clever politician, a very smart guy. He saw an opportunity, and the opportunity was basically that, you experts can tell me one way or the other, but authoritarian regimes have this kind of rot to them, and that rot is corruption. They just get very comfortable. They become self-dealing, and you just saw that. And again, we'll put in the show notes a really good rundown of all of this in Foreign Affairs magazine by what's the guy's name? He's one of the guys that really dug into the sort of corruption networks in Hungary as a Hungarian social scientist. Name escapes me at this point. But he points out just like the extent to what this was. So like what was striking to me about this is a Fidesz insider, clearly a very clever politician, sees his opening, 2 years ago, to drive this wedge, which is like these guys are corrupt. People are seeing it. It's hard to avoid. Now that, I think leverages the fact that you have these sort of alternative internet, means of getting your message out. People who read, online also feel like they're getting the real truth. That's the other sort of dynamic of a lot of this stuff. So corruption and anti-corruption is like it's a godsend. It's really easy. The one person when I think about who's like truly successful in this, and I think is actually for me is like a template when you think about Magyar, is who hasn't been successful and he's dead now, is Alexei Navalny, who to my mind kind of did the exact same thing, like used online and just drilled in like these guys are thieves. They're thieves and they're stealing from you, and you're a sucker if you don't understand that these guys are thieves.
I followed the election sort of from afar, but like I got the same kind of sense that like that was the message, and he wouldn't get swayed by it. He didn't take the bait to talk about gay rights. He stood by things like border enforcement, which are popular. He stood didn't commit on any of the Ukraine stuff because that too is kind of divisive. And he was just like, don't listen to these guys; they steal from you. So what I'm getting at here is just like it's important to, I think, note that a lot of the stuff, because we code things as authoritarianism and democracy, when an authoritarian loses, you say democracy triumphed, but there's an element here, an unknown element, of course, of this guy triumphed, and he's kind of, I don't know, like maybe part of that world. I don't know. What do you think?
No, I mean, I think that's great. I mean, like, so we're talking about elite defection. So I'll say something, I don't know, controversial. There's a rhyme with the color revolution, so the 2000s, because a lot of the color revolutions, ultimately the mobilization is based on anti-corruption, and in some countries nationalism, actually.
Yeah.
And
Navalny was a nationalist too. That's the other
absolutely.
Part.
Well, that was one of his strengths, right?
Yep.
So Navalny never ends up getting his color revolution, even his attempt, right? We have 2011, I guess, which is the closest, but it's not quite the same. But in any case, like we have this vision because it's passed down to us through the NGOs that everything is about sort of procedural liberalism or sort of sociocultural liberalism, or it's joining the EU. Now, for activists, disproportionately, yes, that's absolutely the case. For many people, the joining the EU thing is really, really important. Absolutely. And it's also a shorthand for anti-corruption, rule of law, and so on and so forth. But really what people will respond to is a pure anti-corruption message. Often laundered through is a pejorative way of saying it, but like washed through a nationalist or national identity focus, right? Getting this sense that it's actually quite populist as well. Magyar very much so is a populist. It's I've maintained, and people don't like it when I say this, that Viktor Orbán should no longer be coded as a populist, and probably shouldn't have by the mid 2010s, because at that point he did create the elite in Hungary, right?
Well, you can't. That's
like you can't be the people elite
populists.
distinction,
well,
right?
Exactly.
You
can't do that because, like,
well, Orbán was really successful, right? We talk about all these like Hungarian think tanks and like conservative counter elites and all of that. Orbán actually did it. Right. Yeah. So as a result, he can't run against the elite that he created and funded and supported, also through the corruption aspect. Yeah. But to your point, Magyar really emphasizes the standard pattern of producing a negative coalition in which you can kind of believe that your particular views are going to be replicated in the government, but that's not the most important thing. You're mostly voting someone out as opposed to voting someone in. And he capitalized on it brilliantly. And it really matters, to your point, Magyar's a Fidesz guy, or a former Fidesz guy. Now, do we know what kind of Fidesz guy he was? Was he just there because he was ambitious and he wanted to get ahead? Did he have ideological real beliefs that focus on that sort of national patriotic or national conservative ethos that Fidesz supported? Is it both? Is it neither? We'll find out. The campaign suggests that he does have that national conservative bent, at least on something, certainly on migration, certainly on Hungarian views on sort of the diaspora beyond, the comments in Slovakia and so on, the Trianon map, and all of that. So we'll find out. We'll find out how much of the sort of Budapest activist class ends up coming into government. We don't know yet. That's part of the question.
So, like, you just then it's the next push, because you said, like, he has these majorities, he can like basically do whatever he wants. But at the same time, the big danger when you run a sort of negative campaign like this, a negative coalition, is that you actually have, well, like just legitimacy of throwing the guy out. You don't have any positive legitimacy necessarily. You have to figure out what that is. So now you have to start, as soon as you start making moves, you start making enemies within your coalition, because it's not a natural coalition at all. It's like basically everyone but. And so, he may be constrained by that, but then the other thing is, again, given the constitutional system and given what Orbán was able to put in place, he's got a lot of tools at his disposal potentially, where he doesn't have to be a good Democrat. And like, all the hopes and all of the sort of journalistic, write-ups of all of this is this guy is bringing Hungary back to where it was. And as you said, maybe, but like, what's the literature say about like as you were hinting at earlier, like how likely is this to hold?
I don't know. So there's two questions here. There's the negative voting coalition, of which we're not even fully clear yet, anyway, who exactly it was. Right? We know it's majority of the Hungarian voting population. It's obviously the Budapest center and the suburbs around it, but it's also beyond that. And we know the swing voter is not someone who is aligned with the Brussels or tradition, right? The swing voter is an anti-corruption voter, or a soft former Fidesz voter, we think, probably. But we'll find out, right? But that's the voting coalition. Now there's a parliamentary coalition, which may not reflect that voting coalition at all, because the parliamentary coalition was chosen during the process of creating the TISA party, which is a brand new party. And so it's feeding in at least some of the old party structures and old party elites. It's feeding in some personal connections close to Magyar himself. It's also feeding in a bunch of presumably randos who were willing to run in a constituency they didn't think they were going to win, and now they're going to win. And so that parliamentary coalition is potentially very different from the voting coalition. So we often talk in British politics, for example, that the parliamentary coalitions are really way more aligned on certain ideological things than the populations that actually vote for them, right? There's a big skew in the British system and how votes are translated into elites. In Hungary, there is a translation of votes to elites, and we don't know who those elites are. We don't have a good sense, and we don't know how cohesive they'll be. One of the really interesting thing that Orbán said today, was Fidesz is holding a big national party congress, right? Because Fidesz is a continental European style political party. They have party congresses. They do personnel cadre politics, all of that. It's a little bit unfamiliar to Americans, but that's how they do it. They're going to call this. And he goes on an interview and he says, "I built the parliamentary figures for government." What he means is he put loyalists in who were always going to vote for and weren't going to cause problems. And you can do that when you keep winning for 16 years. You develop a coalition in the parliament, right, institutionally, that works with what you're trying to do. And you want to maintain full control of the agenda. You don't want defectors. You don't want any of that. And Orbán says, now that we're in opposition, I don't want that. I need something else. I need workhorses. I need ambitious people who can do good PR, all of that sort of thing. So he's talking again. We'll see what ends up happening. We'll see if Fidesz even survives, right? They could.
Well, that's the question, right? Is like,
right?
I mean, I mean, that's another way to maybe think about authoritarianism in this, is like whether the ruling party is a party at all, or how much it ends up being, a cutout for a corrupt mega oligarch and a bunch of his cronies, right?
Yeah. Well, so what's interesting, so the underlying point is that the TISA party, we don't know if it's going to be cohesive.
Sure, TISA.
I know, I understand. Yeah. But so on the TISA side of things, the analog, and it's weird and it's not quite the same, but the analog is actually En Marche, the French dominant party under Macron's when
party.
He first won when he won the first election. It's sort of this sort of centrist, center right, center left. Good governance, elite kind of technocracy oriented, reject the left and right divide group of people, and they fill the French parliament because they win this huge majority. And the way the French electoral system works is that it ended up creating them a very large parliamentary majority for a while. He then screws it up in subsequent elections, but for a while he had this nice dominant party that sat in the middle of the French political system, institutionally controlled the parliament. And the French political system is such that if you control the parliament doesn't do anything, right? The parliament's really, really degraded in terms of institutional power de facto. And so Macron did whatever he wanted for quite a long time. That broke down, though, because he started getting defections, because the economic reforms weren't going the way that was expected. Macron finally had to reveal if he was going to govern on the center left or the center right, and that matters to French elites. And that became a problem over time. But for a while, he had this nice thing going. TISA might have that, or Magyar might have that in TISA, or he might have a more obstreperous group of people. We don't know yet how they're going to interact.
But the main thing is then it's in that sense, there's hope for democracy, because if he comes in, he's got twin challenges. One is his majority. The other one is sort of unraveling the tentacles of the old Orbán regime, which persist in a lot of places. And that's why you see these interviews of him talking to the TV people. But
Mhm.
it's like, in a way, it's, how do I put it? If he's very successful in unraveling the tentacles, he'll have to use probably authoritarian methods to do it pretty quickly. And if he is not successful, then like the other party can sort of come back. But then, maybe democracy is stronger if sort of he follows the Macron trajectory, where he has enough legitimacy to last for a while, but then it starts draining away from him. And I know people are terrified at Macron losing because he's got like
Le Pen
demons
comes
left and
in.
right of him at this point. But even that's whatever, that's democracy. Who cares
Sure.
if you got demons to left and right? Like that's
Absolutely.
what it stands for. Go on, Shadi.
If I can sharpen the point a little bit, I think you have this paradox or dilemma after you have a newly elected, seemingly democratic leader, where sometimes they're tempted to engage in authoritarian behavior to undo what came before, and to basically, we saw this during the Arab Spring in Egypt, for example, where when Mohammed Morsi and the Brotherhood were elected, they became somewhat authoritarian, but that was in part because they were facing off against a deep state that was trying to subvert them at every turn. So I don't think there's going to be something similar to a deep state in the context of Hungary, but I think there is that kind of tension of how hard do you go if you want to protect, if you can it really be possible to protect democracy by being more authoritarian?
Yes.
I mean, it's a great question. So I take the hard line. I try very hard not to describe policies or even sort of procedural actions or institutional reforms or changes as authoritarian, unless they're actually changing the degree to which you have that electoral uncertainty over outcome, right, over time. Because there are a lot of things that are coercive that states do all the time, and we could call it an authoritarian change, or we could call it a necessary good government reform. And it partly depends on your perspective. We can get a little bit too libertarian in our assumptions that any use of state power is illegitimate if it's on our side, or if it's not on our side, right? So we have to be careful about that. So my answer is I usually just don't describe these things as authoritarian. What's going to happen is there's going to be a Doge equivalent, right? Like Magyar is going to Doge a lot of the Hungarian state, and he's going to Doge as much of it as he can. He's going to do it more effectively because he has full constitutional powers. A parliamentary system already has very few checks and balances. It's absolutely incorrect to pretend that separation of powers exists in a parliamentary system in the same way. That's not true. And there's been 15 years of writing among constitutional theorists in Europe, providing a long literature train that the government can cite, saying what we're doing is completely fine and normal. And so that like legitimacy is already pre-established because there's lots of money that's been flowing for years in academic efforts and legal scholar efforts to make it so that that's completely normal. Now, the question of whether or not that's actually okay, it depends on the eye of the believer, right, or the eye of the viewer. I think what we're gonna find, the easy reforms are reforms to state media, right? He's gonna do that on day one. He's gonna fire most of them, right? And that's going to happen. There's going to be a massive fight over the judiciary, right? Because the judiciary is perceived to be packed by Fidesz loyalists. The question is actually going to be whether or not there's an effort to say that the judiciary itself is illegitimate, which would call into question the Constitution, say that the Constitution is illegitimate, and that's a bold path to go down. Which could be a problem. We're seeing a lot of this in Poland right now.
I was about to say it's echoes of Poland, and they're having a lot of trouble making these moves, right?
Right. So this is one reason why I don't use the authoritarianism term to describe policies per se, and why I think the democratic backsliding checklists are bad. Is that as far as the checklist is concerned, Donald Tusk's Poland is 100% doing democratic backsliding, right? Like they have taken control of the media broadcast. They are fighting with the judiciary. They are doing legally dubious things. They're saying it's in the name of protecting democracy. It might be, it might not. I'd prefer to just not call any of that necessarily automatically authoritarian per se. I call it hardball politics. There's institutional hardball politics in all democracies. Poland never autocratized, so it makes it easier. they're just fighting really vociferously about all of this. And it's going to go through lawyers and it's going to go through adjudications. And it's only going to be determined in the longue durée after multiple elections. And we'll find out, what the result is.
And
in Hungary, it's more difficult.
Yeah. I mean, what's nice about like talking to you, that what I enjoy and what I enjoy about reading you is that, like, having those habits of mind and having those commitments to basically not make these kinds of statements, is what you're doing is you're stripping a certain kind of moral valence out of these conversations, which is useful and healthy because it's this like squishy middle, because it's gray, because these lines are weird. It's hard, and again, in sort of global media, other democracies, trials and tribulations become a spectator sport, and like, what team are you on?
Right.
It's and all of it's kind of, it's fine. You can do that. You can moralize these things. Maybe it's clarifying to a certain extent, but I always find it like almost certainly not an absolute set of categories, right? Like it's, and Shadi and I go about this all the time. It's like, democracy good. Well, sure. Like, but it's not necessarily
right.
Yeah.
Well, and I mean, like, and I agree with all of that.
Go ahead. Sorry,
Shadi,
you're unmuted.
Yep.
Go ahead.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to say, like, we're talking about morality. I'm curious, just to pivot a little bit, Julian, if you could talk to us about the moralizing that took place over the past decade against Hungary or against Orbán. A lot of it justified because he was a bad guy and he was a strongman of some sort, but that sometimes it went a little bit too far in describing his regime as authoritarian and a dictatorship, that there was just a lot of liberal posturing sometimes about that, in a way that wasn't necessarily offering a fair picture of what Hungary actually was. Because one of the reasons that the opposition failed to win in previous rounds was because they were so fractured and disunified, and they weren't actually that impressive. And so it was reasonable for people not to vote for them. And so people forget about that you need to have a good opposition that is unified, that is able to offer an affirmative vision. And that's what Peter Magyar was able to do with TISA. But I'm just curious, how have you, looking back, knowing what we know now, how do you view the American moralizing from the left here in this country, but also the fact that the American right, elevated Hungary as a kind of model,
as a moral cause,
as a moral cause, in a way that was like mind-boggling and very unpleasant. And I think now, some of them will have some regrets, but I feel like you had moralizing on both sides in a way that wasn't particularly helpful.
I mean, there's like the billion excellent points there, and I agree with you entirely on all of this sort of thing. I think to take it in order, one thing that we hadn't mentioned, well, I guess we'll go from the more nitty-gritty onwards towards the bigger moralizing aspect, is that one reason why the Hungarian regime is pretty soft is because it could be because the Hungarian opposition was sort of famously bad. Like Fidesz had won a free and fair election in 2010, coming off of a massive corruption scandal, and not only financial corruption and wrongdoing, but also like recordings of the former left-leaning government saying, "Oh yeah, we tell our voters one thing and then we do the exact opposite," right? And it's like huge scandals. And then ever since then, many of those older leaders from the 2000s just continued and persevered. And you get the situation where you have kind of sclerotic, really underperforming opposition parties. Not only are they fragmented and fractured and they have lots of personalities that butt heads, but they're also just unappealing. So it's not surprising that you're going to get votes for. We actually saw this in Georgia recently, which is also an electoral authoritarian regime. It's actually significantly more coercive than the Hungarian one was. We saw the protests a few years ago. Very strong restrictions on assembly and speech and all of that. Much stronger media control, even much more gerrymandering for what it's worth. But also, the opposition parties are very, very unpopular, relatively speaking. They do not crest above very, very low percentages of voter support. And it's great when you have that situation. But to get to the broader moralizing issue, on the side of the anti-Orbán world, which is all of academia, most policy journalists, and all of that, oftentimes it's coming from a perfectly reasonable place. It's coming from personal convictions. It's also coming from the sense of a rigged or skewed electoral conditions in which Orbán can't lose. There are also other aspects where it gets kind of lopped into one giant heap of badness. So not only is Orbán and Fidesz bad domestically, but they also have the incorrect foreign policy, right? They insufficiently support Ukraine in X, Y, or Z. They're too friendly to regimes we don't like. They're not supporting, migration issues in Europe and so on. They're kind of at this big squeaky wheel. And unfortunately, what happens is that when you get very emotional about all of this, then you start saying things like, "Oh, Hungary is fascist," and it's Putin's puppet, and it's also run by Russia. It's actually run by the FSB and the GRU, and there's going to be little green men popping down in Hungary that showed up the day before the election. You start getting into kind of an absurd place. Because, so for example, to take the foreign policy issue, Hungary has certain material interests that aren't going to change, right? And Peter Magyar has been very clear that they're going to maintain the sort of pragmatic energy policy towards Russia because you can't just change your energy system overnight. And Hungary is not wealthy enough to just shoot itself in the foot like the Germans did in terms of their own energy policy and accept the consequences of that. They're not going to do that. As a result, there's always going to be a pro-Russian sort of component to Hungarian foreign policy, especially as relevant to the European Union, for example. Another example is the fight with Ukraine. Hungary has a small diaspora in Ukraine that's been there for a long time. The Ukrainian government has absolutely engaged in attempts at assimilation, Ukrainianization. That's definitely true. That's a sort of a harsh touch point in Hungarian politics. It always has been. It's not going to change unless that population is actually ethnically cleansed, right? So some things aren't going to change in either the Hungarian domestic context or the Hungarian foreign policy context. And we get this kind of list of all the bad things go together and then all the good things go together. And that becomes a big problem. And then we get onto moralization. So there's no reason why you should support Viktor Orbán necessarily, right? We don't want to go there. There's also no reason why you have to, especially as an analyst or an academic or policy journalist or something like that, trying to provide a somewhat nuanced picture, there's no reason why you need to play the role of the PR cheerleader, right? Just sort of talking that way or acting that way. You want to be at least more nuanced. That's always been my view of this. It's also, there's a time where you really need the hard-hitting emotional essay and really show like the corruption in Hungary, for example. That's really important. That really does matter. You also need people like me and some other colleagues who step back and say, okay, let's look at the actual real world as it really exists and see how we can make comparisons, what we're actually talking about. I'll give you one final example. There's been a lot of talk, especially during this election. Hungary is the poorest country in Europe, or poorest country in the EU. That's the new line. And according to some measures, yes, that's true. According to other measures, it kind of depends, purchasing power parity and all of that. There's no way around the fact that Orbán mismanaged the economy after COVID. It's also no way around the fact that if you walk through Hungary, walk through Budapest, or even in the countryside, it's going to look better than some other EU countries, like Bulgaria, for example. And you don't need to pretend these things. Like, it's not necessary to make up things that aren't true or need to be so heavily caveated when you actually dive in to make the case that, wow, there's tremendous economic mismanagement. A lot of it is due to corruption. A lot of it is due to this sort of semi-statist economic policy that exists. And those are bad things. But we don't have to dial it up to 11. And so anyway, that's a long ramble. I'm sorry.
Another point on that, I mean, it seems like a lot of Americans were also projecting when it came to Hungary. When they called the Hungarian regime fascist or called Orbán fascist, they were thinking not necessarily about Orbán, but about Donald Trump. And I think that a lot of the rhetoric that was applied to Hungary was applied to our own country. That, are we really a democracy any longer? Are we a democracy that's about to die? Are we actually fascist in some kind of way? and the popularization of calling MAGA and Donald Trump fascists, that became very mainstream, and it still
Mhm.
is quite mainstream. So I know that's more about domestic politics, but I think that there's just something fascinating about how Hungary sort of became this kind of blank canvas upon which to
Mhm.
project either our greatest hopes or our greatest fears.
Absolutely.
And I'll just say, right, like, I mean, you have scholars like Tim Snyder who are convinced we're Trump's not going to have elections and there's going to be shenanigans. And to be fair, from everything we've seen, I guess, remains to be seen. But like, it's still like the Hungarian example does, as you were
Mhm.
saying, Shadi, just like sort of gives you like, okay, well, let's take a deep breath, maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe.
So, there's 3 points, I guess, on that. First, I mean, I think the Hungarian election is a very good reminder that we do need to sometimes step back, and sometimes we turn these categories, we reify these categories, and then the country can't change, right? Like, the entire discussion about the media ecosystem evolving is a question of temporal change, a change over time. That in fact, a regime doesn't stay put in terms of its either coercive ability or ability to control a political system, right? Like, that tells you that we need to be constantly iterating. For a political scientist, what that means is you do need to ask the question, hey, was this actually less bad than we thought? You don't have to say the answer is yes. You probably do need to think it through. You probably do need to revisit it. That's sort of thing one. Thing two, is to this question of Hungary as the bête noire is well established. And there's a lot of people who can talk about that. Hungary as like the shining beacon on the hill is also very, very interesting, and it's a smaller group of people. It's predominantly in the United States. It's associated with the current administration, with intellectuals and influencers. There's a lot of people say, well, why? It doesn't make any sense. And I actually don't think that's correct. I actually think it makes a lot of sense because, and I've written this before, Hungary is, in essence, the post-liberal Sweden, right? So for a lot of progressives in the United States or people on the left in general, they look at Scandinavian countries, and usually they look at Sweden, and they see this wonderful social democracy with all these benefits, lots of institutions and money put in the right direction, high efficiency, this wonderful sort of thing, all this public transit, all this healthcare, and everything. And it shows the example of here's what we can do. Nobody says we should be France. A lot of people say we should try to be Sweden, or New York City should try to be more like Sweden, or something like that, right? It's a touchstone model. And it's nice because Sweden is a small, formerly homogenous country with relatively high state capacity in the European vein, with a pretty decisive political system when you actually have strong government. And as we were saying earlier, Sweden is an example of a dominant party democratic system during the period where that welfare state was built, right? Now it's a little different. But back in the day, the Swedish model is built in that particular way, a very decisive, strong government. Hungary is simply that example for the set of post-liberals who were conservative or on the right in the United States, who view that one should not pursue conservative goals through a laissez-faire approach, right, or a sort of a status quo, what you might call liberal conservatism, but instead you need the assertive use of state power to achieve policy ends. And those should be done directly. Those should be done through changing institutions, right, including sort of harsh reformatting of educational institutions, creation using government money of supportive intellectual networks, of supportive other institutions and organizations and networks, and encouraging specific policies that matter, like family policy, for example, is a very strong touchstone. Hungary, a small country, able to do this. So that's what the example offers, that shows, to quote a conference from a couple of years ago, with a gathering a bunch of post-liberals and national conservatives, another world is possible. And that is what Hungary offers. If you actually talk to American post-liberals, they're mostly not going to say that we can make Hungary on the Potomac. That's not what they're trying to do, but they are using this as an example, not only of, hey, we should try this policy idea or that policy idea. It's also a general orientation of what the state is for. And the Hungarian model is a Central Eastern European statist legacy, right? Coming back from even before communism. It's very natural in Hungary to use state power to achieve political ends, right? That's not surprising. For post-liberals in the United States, they see the traditional Republican Party and say, well, why aren't we doing that?
Yeah, I mean, for me, just as a stroppy Slav, it's more like, it feels like both sides have something to worry about here. Ultimately, Orbanism was so decisively rejected, so that tells you something about popularity for the right. And on the other side, it's we'll see where Magyar ends up, and whether he disappoints a lot of the sort of, again, people who are moralizing against Orbán, so that anything but Orbán necessarily is a knight in shining armor that may not pan out. Anyway,
on that
go
point,
ahead,
David,
Shai.
I'll just say, my perspective is that most people don't actually genuinely, really, really believe in democracy. They believe in their own side winning.
Yep.
And
Yes.
I think as long as Peter Magyar is seen as being on the right side of history, people will give him a lot of room to maneuver. And let's say he does become more coercive in some way. I think a lot of people would say, well, it's coercion for the right cause.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
As is happening in Poland, right? That's
as is happening in many places and will continue.
Yeah. Anyway, this was an incredibly rich conversation. Julian, thanks so much for joining us. I guess we'll keep an eye on things and how it's going, and maybe check in a few months, see how authoritarianism is being defeated or not.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it. And one final plug, if you are interested in the question of authoritarianism in America, I have a recent article out on that too.
Oh, excellent. We'll definitely put it in the show notes. Thanks, Julian. Bye.
Thanks.